to the 12th Annual Education for Activists Conference. 2 days of education, discussion, and debate about today's key issues and the political alternatives facing humanity. My name is Elizabeth Weiss, and I'm a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and a member of SA and your MC or chair, whatever, for the conference. We acknowledge that this gathering takes place on the unceded territories of the Huron-Wendat and Petan First Nations, the Seneca Mississaugas of the New Credit, and Haudenosaunee people. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This event is dedicated to the memory of Mitch Podolak, the founder of the Winnipeg Folk Music Festival and a longtime supporter of Socialist action. Sorry about that, folks. Mitch passed away on August the 25th. We miss him very much. Sorry for the interruption of my phone. Yes, we really do miss Mitch and wish he could be here. We call this gathering an Education for Activists Conference. Why? Because more people today are becoming activists, looking for socialist answers to the problems we face that comes from a toxic global system to decline. Many are turning to revolutionary Marxism for a scientific explanation of the ills of capitalism. Moreover, they want to know what to do about it. They are looking for effective action. This weekend, we'll be looking at history, economics, ecology, and political strategy. You will hear proposals for a concrete program for action. We are proudly part of the working class. Workers are the vast majority of society, over 80%, 85% of the total. But if the problem was just a matter of overcoming the super rich 1% minority, the working class would have solved the problem a long time ago with a simple vote. Unfortunately, there is a huge apparatus of control that keeps the capitalist class in power. Divide and rule is their method. The challenge facing the working class is to unite across the lines of oppression, whether the basis of that oppression is race, gender, sexual orientation, language, or nationality. We need to unite, but to do so in an effective way. We need to develop and implement the program and strategy required for working class victory. By critically assessing political issues, past and present, as we will do at this conference, we can find a way forward. We begin tonight with imperialism, origins and nature of the system. Are Russia and China imperialists? We are pleased to have our speakers, Comrade Jeff Mackler, Socialist candidate for President of the United States, and Robbie Mahood, leading member of SALAS Canada, based in Montreal. But before we go to our speakers, we are going to have a cultural event. We are pleased to open with Giovanna Riccio reading her poem about the public campaign to take the plant at GM Oshawa. And after that, George Eliot Clark, National Poet Laureate to 1617, who will present an anti-imperialist poem. So please, first welcome, Sister.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here for a weekend of socialism. Hooray.
Yeah.
Hooray. Yeah, I'll say. And I'm glad to see Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg back here. I was just writing a poem about Rosa Luxemburg. It's called a Rosa Luxemburg Botanical, a different kind of rose. Anyway, so I'm sorry I can't stay for the weekend. George and I have to go to Ottawa for a book launch. We're leaving in the morning. And so we're just here for a brief time. But I was asked to write this poem when we had our panel discussion about the feasibility of nationalizing the GM plant, and that was on September 30th. And I was very, very happy that Barry asked me to come in and open the conference. I'm very honored to be here and to support you, all of you, in offering an alternative to the BS we have to put up with every day.
You're here.
Okay, how's that? Good. Okay, so this poem is called Planting Light. My lungs ache, my chest tightens when I remember the skylark's grounded wings, the mangled contract. How fossil fuel tycoons every day got away with murder, while snug in private planes, smug GM execs jetted through workday rainbows, incinerating 4 generations of auto workers, all the while poor-mouthing, emitting do-gooder bunk as secretly they idled the clock. Mum about concessions and 2-tiered wages. Assembly lines rear-ended as they piled up dinero, tight-lipped about in cahoots politicians or billions in lapsed loans. Forgive and forget about GM on the dole, pocketing bailouts as backhanded bounty, so corporate bums ride on the taxpayer's dime, then crash the books till numbers combust to a scorched earth policy. And Mary Barra, cushy in the company stretch limo hearse, trolling a geopolitical dirge for Oshawa, hitching our unallocated plan to a no-rules playbook, steering daily bread south to another maquiladora spewing cars and trucks, beggaring Mexican workers to line GM's pockets. And far from crude, slicked beaches, far from gulls glazed in black gold, oily Molochs brew barrels of ecocide, blind to babes bartered to Exxon and the Koch brothers, deaf to teens exhausted by the internal combustion engine, choking on tomorrow going up in smoke. Brave and unruly the young, eyeing a rusty maple leaf against melting polar ice, bearing witness to the ravaged grandeur of Atlantic right whales sacrificed to drunken cruise ships and dollar store freight carriers. Unafraid of climate refugees pitched by ocean waves fisting the sky. Too green are they to weather hope flattened by hurricanes, cutting class each Friday to tug the state's ear closer to truth. Aggrieved and grieving, they stare down the UN's fake nod and bigwigs who back away from a future snuffed by the ever-thin promise of permanent jobs flowing from trickle-down economics through pipelines into the shareholders' insatiable maw. Cavalier gardens hold hostage their planet, rub out the moon, and splinter the stars. It's no surprise when Oshawa darkens, when a kingpin daddy fuses dream to nightmare and torpedoes the kid next door. But if parents love progeny, they must keep house, be one with earth. Figure that one's a number that grows on itself, person by person. It summons unity, sums pushback and power, nurturing union. Like Vanguard Greta voicing one global choir, tuning street and jungle in an emerald anthem. They strike for nature's all indigenous union, seeding a clearing through carbonized sky. And one shouts no to an orderly wind down. Oshawa grabs the driver's seat, keeps on the lights. Auto workers become beacons, veto fossilized civics. As citizens run e-vehicles through bulldozer blight, a new plant electrifies GM's shuttered heart. Too much for business. Status quo sharks sound a greenback backlash. Best retrain folks to buy capital spin. But prophets, intrepid, see a PM who billions a soul-fracking pipeline can pony up bullion, squeeze out carbon, let dawn the people's unbreakable diamond hard light. Thank you.
Okay, so now we call upon George Elliott Clark. Brother Clark. Woo!
All right. Great pleasure to be here and to be reminded that all of our troubles around the planet right now are related to the imperialist project that began 500 years ago and continues to unfold, despite some pushback here and there and so forth. Although now that the future of the entire planet is in jeopardy, we might expect that the pushback will be stronger and widespread and broad-based and difficult for anyone to stop. I want to recite a chant, and it's for the murdered and the missing. Because of the fact that where we are right now in this country, and with all of the issues around resource extraction, the fact that we have a G8 economy that is based on developing world economics in terms of tearing apart our land, poisoning our water in order to make ourselves supposedly wealthy, and at the same time disparaging and destroying the cultures and peoples that are indigenous to this place. So, for the murdered and the missing. Someone's guilty of 1,000,000 crimes. Blood on his hands, death on his mind, to send my sister away, away, to put my mama in a distant grave. Why she got to be murdered? Why she got to go missing? This land is hers, so I heard. All the saints are insisting. Someone's gotta sink in hell and rot, dumped bones in bush or parking lot. Disappeared my auntie, saw her die, exiled my daughter, served her misery. Why she got to go missing? Why she got to be murdered? Why I hear justice hissing like a viper in a graveyard? Someone's papa mapped a trail of tears. Someone's son paved a highway of tears. Why my sister gotta stumble down? Why my mama gotta humble down? Why she got to go missing? Why she got to be martyred? Indigenous insisting justice for our massacred. Justice for our massacred. Someone's flag looks like blood on snow. Someone's history's a damn crime show to hurt my daughter. So she weep to wound my auntie while she sleep. Why she got to be murdered? Why she got to go missing? Martyred in mud, slush smeared from the paw to Nipissing. Someone's guilty of 1,000,000 crimes from 5 centuries back down to next time. Ain't sorry to Lil sister rape or put my mama in her too soon grave. Why she got to be murdered? Why she got to go missing? Ain't all government alert to crimes of commission? Why don't this parliament wail? How can this parliament fail? Got to have justice insisting. No more murdered, no more missing, no more homicide, suicide, genocide, no screaming words that none can hide. No more trails and highways of tears. No more families cramming each a hearse. Time to put the guilty where they belong, on trial in jail by the end of this song. Why she got to go missing? Why she got to be murdered? Why I hear justice hissing like a viper in a graveyard? Why she got to go missing? Why she got to be murdered? Indigenous insisting justice for our massacred. Justice for our massacred. Justice, 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 justice for our massacred. Justice, 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 justice for our massacred. Why she got to go missing? Why she got to be murdered?
Yay.
Okay, thank you so very much, sister and brothers. These were powerful, powerful poems. So, safe journey to Ottawa when you have to leave. Okay, so now we're going to come back to our panel, as I said before, and our first speaker tonight will be Robbie Mahood. Go ahead, comrade.
Thanks. Good evening, comrades and friends. I hate to bring us down to and lower the tone of those last two performances, really, and it was really impressive. Thank you very much. So I'm tasked with the job of doing a bit of an educational about imperialism, as I understand it. It's not exactly a topic that I consider myself to be an expert on, but I'll tell you what I've found in my readings and also from my own political experience. So, the conquest and subjugation of some people by others is as old as class society. Let's start with that. Imperialism in the generic sense of conquest, domination, and levying of tribute existed before capitalism. We only have to think about Rome, of Greece, Persia, and the Chinese empires. The first point I want to make is that there is an analogy here with patriarchy, that is, the subjugation of women. Capitalism inherited these systems of oppression and adapted them to its own requirements. Imperialism, like patriarchy, was a precondition for the rise of capitalism. Its specific forms have changed over time in accordance with the needs of capital. Imperialism is an intrinsic feature of capitalist development, but it's not synonymous or reducible to it. One can be anti-imperialist, for example, without recognizing the need to overthrow capitalism. Though it may be difficult, but certainly one can encounter many people like that. And just as one can also oppose patriarchy without recognizing that women's oppression is rooted in capitalist society. We'll go back to Marx a bit. Marx took the emerging system of industrial capitalism as his object of study in order to decipher its inner laws and contradictions. He and Engels acknowledged that European capital's takeoff depended crucially on colonial plunder and the slave trade. As Marx put it in his usual, somewhat poetic fashion, the veiled slavery of the wage laborers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as its pedestal. The treasures captured outside of Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder flowed back to the mother country and were turned into capital there. But Marx and Engels, despite that very important recognition, did not engage in a study of imperialism in the capitalist sense because capitalism's inherent expansionary and competitive dynamic, leading to greater and greater accumulation of capital, had not yet overflowed national boundaries in their lifetimes. The rivalry, though, between the capitalist powers in Europe and elsewhere intensified at the close of the 19th and the early 20th centuries, setting the stage for the first of two brutal inter-imperialist wars. Lenin, who was a member of a subsequent generation of Marxists, wrote his pamphlet, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in the middle of the First World War, in the midst of the battlefield slaughter in Europe. Like most of his writing, it was a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. It was sharply posed, and it was intended as a guide to action. In it, he identified the main features of a new imperial phase of capitalism that included greater and greater concentration of capital, the fusion of industrial and finance capital, monopolization and the formation of giant cartels competing for world markets, the growing importance of the export of capital, and the race to divide up the world between the great powers. For Lenin, the war had not been an aberration, but a product of capitalism's barbaric and regressive tendencies, once its imperialist form became manifest. The socialist leaders who backed the war had become social imperialists. For Lenin, the division of nations into oppressor and oppressed formed the very essence of imperialism. Therefore, a world socialist revolution and a transition to communism was necessary to liberate humanity from the huge disparities of wealth, the oppression and predation of weak nations and peoples, militarism, and endless war that were the inevitable accompaniments of capitalism's imperialist stage. Lenin, of course, has been widely criticized, primarily on the right wing of the political spectrum over the decades, but also from the left. It's certainly true that some of his observations are if not, they're not false, but they're less true today. For instance, direct overseas investment plays a less important role than at the time Lenin was writing. On the other hand, not many more countries have been added to the imperialist club since Lenin's time. Unless, of course, we grant club privileges to Russia and China, and we're going to deal with that question, I think, in Jeff's presentation. So I'll leave that question dangling for the moment. It's been over a century since Lenin wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage. We've seen a momentous series of events in the last 100 years. The Stalinist degeneration of the Soviet Union, fascism, a second inter-imperialist war that was also a war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the emergence of the US as chief capitalist hegemon, the throwing off of the colonial yoke by the peoples of Africa and Asia, revolutionary victories against imperialism in China, in North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. And then followed by neoliberalism as a response to the capitalist stagnation of the 1970s, and the crisis in profits. The fall of the Soviet Union, China's rapid rise to become a major link in globalized capitalist production, failed US wars and interventions in the Middle East, the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, and of course, far from the least, a looming, unchecked climate disaster awaiting us all. For the second part of this presentation, I'd like to fast forward to examine the most important changes in capitalist imperialism a century on from Lenin's time. And here I'll be relying heavily on, and indeed even quoting from, my principal reading for preparation of this presentation, which is a book I heartily recommend, John Smith's Imperialism in the 21st Century, which was published in 2016 and won the inaugural 2016 Paul S. Baran and Paul M. Sweezy Prize, sponsored by the journal Monthly Review. Smith follows, I think, quite consciously in Lenin's footsteps in defining 21st century imperialism as, here I'm quoting, the subjugation of the entire world to the interests of the capitalist ruling classes of a handful of oppressor nations. This definition, I'll repeat it again, the subjugation of the entire world to the interests of the capitalist ruling classes of a handful of oppressor nations. I think this is quite a serviceable definition. It's very concise. It alludes to the political and economic aspects of imperialism. It allows for inter-imperialist rivalries. And it leaves room for the concept of sub-imperialism, in which, as defined by Smith, the capitalist rulers of a subject nation in turn subject other, usually weaker, nations and peoples to their political and economic domination. Smith also argues that his definition does not suggest a merger of the various national ruling classes into a single transnational capitalist class, which has been put forward by other Marxist analysts. And like Smith, I'm rather skeptical of this position on both analytical and political grounds. The book, Imperialism in the 21st Century, starts off by recounting the horrific collapse of the Rana Plaza garment factory in Dhaka in 2013. That's in Bangladesh. Over 1,100 workers died in that catastrophe, which was entirely avoidable. And more than 2,500 were injured. Almost all of them were women, overwhelmingly women. He goes on to choose three iconic global commodities: the t-shirt, the iPhone, and the cup of coffee. And he follows the value chain in each case to demonstrate how global production works in practice to impoverish southern workers and farmers, enrich northern manufacturing and commercial giants, contribute tax revenues to northern governments, and foster the complicity of workers in rich countries, not only by creating a privileged bureaucratic layer, but also, I'm afraid to say, by providing cheap clothes, food, entertainment, and so on, that promote an individualistic consumer lifestyle. The global shift of production to low-wage countries represents, to Smith, a new imperialist stage of capitalist development. The profits of multinational corporations, almost entirely based in Europe, North America, and Japan, are now heavily dependent on the super exploitation of workers in the global south. The same applies to the financial assets generated by these profits and the standard of living of citizens in those rich capitalist nations. Companies seek to cut costs and boost profits by replacing high-wage domestic labor with cheap foreign labor, either through immigration of workers or emigration of production. In the neoliberal era, capital and commodities move with ease, or relative ease, across borders. Not so for workers. Suppression of the free movement of labor greatly reinforces global wage differentials. Migration from low to high wage regions has significantly slowed immigration with the militarization of borders and rising xenophobia. I think the contrast here is with the great wave of European migrants to North America, Australasia, and some other countries in the late 19th and the early 20th century, which was largely without these kind of barriers that we see today. So we now have a travesty of globalization, a world without borders to everything and everyone except for working people. Export-oriented industrialization, otherwise known as outsourcing, is the only capitalist option for poor countries who do not have abundant natural resources. Neoliberal globalization has not only transformed the production of commodities, but also social relations, in particular the capital-labor relation, which is increasingly a relation between northern capital and southern labor. Close to 80% of the world's industrial workforce now live in so-called developing countries, 541 million in 2010, compared to 21% or 145 million industrial workers still in the imperialist core. And notable also is the recruitment of many more women in the developing world to industrial labor. Around 80% of global trade is linked to the international production networks of transnational corporations who have seen their power and reach greatly magnified in the neoliberal era. Neoliberalism has produced a peculiar warped structure to world trade. North-North rivalry exists, but practically no North-South competition and cutthroat South-South competition to the point of a race to the bottom. Workers, on the other hand, compete across the global divide, driving down wages in both the less developed and more advanced capitalist countries to the point of resulting in a decrease in labor share of the GDP across the board. Capitalism in its neoliberal variant has uprooted hundreds of millions of workers and farmers in poor nations, expanding the vast pool of super exploitable labor, and together with restriction of migration, producing a dramatic steepening of the international wage gradient. The growth of industrial production in the South has not been enough to absorb this huge pool of untapped labor, and this has resulted in widespread unemployment, migration to urban slums, the breakdown of family and communal ties, and reliance on a massive informal economy. This account completely contradicts the claims of boosters of capitalist globalization such as Thomas Friedman, that we are now, or soon will be, living in a flat earth. That is, we are going to see a gradual rise in wealth and consumption to approximate first world levels in hitherto poor and underdeveloped countries. Smith and his co-thinkers on the Marxist left argue that the salient feature of contemporary imperialism is the export of the capital-labor relationship under terms of national oppression. That phenomenon was not foreseen by Lenin, at least not precisely. It presents Marxists with a new task, the integration of Lenin's theory of imperialism with Marx's theory of value. In addition to absolute and relative surplus value, Marx did posit a third form of surplus value, which he described as the reduction of wages below their value. And this recent generation of Marxist scholars, Andrew Higginbotham as well as Smith and others, argues that this third form of surplus value is that produced under conditions of super exploitation and a central mode of value creation in contemporary imperialism. Let me very briefly advance some conclusions and questions emerging from this sketch of contemporary imperialism. The existence of a few rich, powerful nations at the pinnacle of world capitalism who exploit and dominate the nations and peoples below them has not fundamentally changed over the past century. If we leave the question of Russia and China aside for a moment, even the membership of this exclusive club at the top has not significantly altered in this period of time, even if we admit that a sub-imperial license has been granted to some nations. So one of the questions is clearly whether Russia and China have joined the imperialist club. Not that they aspire to this role or could become imperialist in the future, which is certainly possible, but that they are actually imperialist today. In other words, is the global imperialist system now multipolar rather than the basically unipolar system that has prevailed over the last 75 years, based on the economic and military power of the United States, the dominant economic and military power. A related question is whether, with the rise of China, there has been a partial reversal of the unidirectional flow of wealth towards the old imperial core, and the beginning of a significant transfer in the other direction, that is from west to east, if not from the north to the global south. Well, leading Marxist intellectuals are divided on this question, as are different tendencies on the left, and including in debates within our own movement that reflect these questions. I don't want to get into speaking too much of other tendencies on the left, but the International Socialist tendency is not really surprising that they tend to opt for a view of imperialism as essentially multipolar. They took a traditional third camp position in the past, and this seems to have returned them, unfortunately, to an abstentionist position on many contemporary conflicts, if not, in some cases, an adaptation to imperialist propaganda. The Fourth International majority appears to have convinced itself that the global situation is so complex and so chaotic that its efforts should go into building a third democratic and progressive alternative, responding to conflicts according to the criterion of the preservation of human life and the rights of people. Nobody can be indifferent to human suffering, but it represents a terrible regression, in my opinion, to reduce politics to the level of humanitarian intervention. Socialist Action has chosen to stick with the socialist analysis of imperialism and to intervene in support of a working class program. In that way, we believe we can respond to the wars and regime change operations of imperialism in a coherent fashion. One of our principal priorities then is to build solidarity with the struggles of workers and oppressed peoples in the formerly colonial and largely now semi-colonial countries and peoples. Instilling an anti-imperialist consciousness in the workers' movement here at home is integral to our own struggle for working class emancipation. I'd be remiss if I didn't address the problem that we face and how we go about supporting working class and popular struggles in the oppressed nations, because it is a source of much, confusion on the left. It seems to me two options present themselves. One is to give uncritical support to any regime that is in the crosshairs of imperialism. This often leads to vulgar apologetics that stops at the point of putting a minus sign where the bourgeoisie puts a plus sign. But the second more serious error is to become preoccupied with the evils of the regimes targeted by Western aggression, and to withhold support for them in the face of this aggression. At its worst, this can serve as a cover for imperialism's agenda, and the least that can be said is that it results often in abstention from work in the anti-imperialist and solidarity movements. Well, Engels said that Marxism is not a doctrine, but a movement. It proceeds not from principles, but rather from facts. It's a little bit simplistic, but I think there's some merit in that observation. So as revolutionary socialists confronted with not only imperialist regime change, but uprisings across the planet, and we're seeing more and more of that, we are obliged, I think, to examine each case in all its complexity and contradiction. The crisis of capitalist imperialism is deepening and looks to be heading us to even more insurgencies that imperialism will certainly try to divert and channel to its own ends, but to have their own dynamic and circumstances. And we're not even speaking here of the cases of direct imperialist intervention and aggression. We have seen some plethora of insurgent movements across the globe in recent months. Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia, Haiti, Lebanon, Hong Kong, Kashmir, and the list goes on. Others could be added. Unfortunately, we're starting from a point where the revolutionary parties that can play a leadership role and affect the course of events are weak and often non-existent. But we cannot bemoan our fate. In the immortal words of Joe Hill, don't mourn, organize. And let's take the measure of the tasks that await us and apply the very best traditions of our revolutionary Marxist tradition, and to do so very consciously. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie. Our next speaker is Comrade Jeff Mackner, who's the National Secretary of SA, Socialist Action USA, and also the Socialist candidate running for the President of the United States.
Next President, Mr. Mackner.
So what about this impeachment? No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, the last time I was here, comrades, I was booed by you.
Golden Blue, Golden State.
Golden State Warriors, and you supported a team called the Toronto Dinosaurs, is it? How many of you know what the record of the Golden State Warriors is today?
Who cares? We don't care.
Elizabeth, I have a bribe in my pocket
I
for an
know.
extra 10 minutes if you will.
Well, you're lucky because Robbie didn't use his time, so I'll give it to you.
Lights off.
Give it to you, but I don't care. I have enough wine, so I don't need any more.
The Warriors have won 2 games this year and 10 losses. They lost the entire starting team. But as imperialist as we are, we're going to buy the Toronto Raptors.
We knew that was coming.
So Robbie used the classic 5 definitions of imperialism. And I want to repeat them quickly. The concentration and production of capital has developed to such a stage that it's created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. In the early 60s, there were something like 164 airline companies in the United States. Today, there are 3. the merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation on the basis of finance capital of a financial oligarchy, which is represented when Bernie Sanders speaks in the United States, for example, the four individuals in the United States own wealth exceeding the bottom half of the entire population of 320 million people. 3, the export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities acquires exceptional importance. 4, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world among themselves. And finally, the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers. That's the nature of Lenin's definition, and it fully applies today. The question before us is where China and Russia fit into this. And I'm only going to deal with that briefly. At our last convention, we produced 2 documents, one on China, arguing that it was imperialist. It was about 45 pages, and it detailed the application of the 5 criteria that I mentioned to the facts of China today. The number of its banks, their ranking on a world scale, which were on a par with the United States, only secondary to the United States. The concentration of capital and monopolies in China. Its capacity to export capital and dominate some world markets. I want to begin on China in 2001, when the United States agreed with the other imperialist powers to allow China to enter the World Trade Organization. No self-respecting imperialist nation would allow China if it was a worker state. Their relations with the worker state were extremely adversarial to enter the World Trade Organization. But the United States, the dominant power who writes the rules, said that China could enter provided that it opened up its labor force and its markets to US and all imperialist participation. And the Chinese did it. So instead of paying workers in the northern countries relatively decent wages, the Chinese Communist Party, which is the instrument of capitalism inside China, allowed foreign corporations to hire teenage women in dormitory factories, working 7 days a week for 6 cents an hour. And this phenomena was the norm across the country. China followed the BRICS formula. How many of you know what BRICS are? Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa. And that is, with a country at that time of 1.3, 1.4 billion people, it sought to squeeze the bottom portion of the population, as is the case in India and Brazil and Russia, so terribly as to transfer that wealth to the creation of a small layer, perhaps 10, 15% of the population, of middle-class people, and 10% of, in China, that could amount to 200 to 300 million people, to make them into consumers for the products that they produced at near slave wages, while the rest of the population was driven to ruin. And that phenomena has taken place across all of the BRICS nations and indeed has become the formula worldwide for development. That is, development at the expense of the vast majority to create their own internal market. 300 million people buying cell phones and other telecommunications equipment is quite a market. And the United States gets very angry when American corporations find that their Apple computers are no longer, or increasingly less competitive. So for decades, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, starting in 2001, China began the process of restoring capitalism in the country. They did it by privatizing the factories, but they disguised the privatization in that they were formally still state properties, but they were leased out to capitalists who operated them as their own for profit. They destroyed the agricultural basis, the communes, the land, and forced millions, literally millions of peasants into the countryside where they required internal passports to work in imperialist factories on the periphery of the major cities of the country. And they exploited them so deeply that they physically lost weight and became almost incapacitated, and they had to be sent back to the countryside to be fattened up and replaced by another generation of Chinese workers. Our 45, 50-page document documented this process in detail. But China had no intention of remaining the cheap labor source for the world imperialist countries. These countries brought state-of-the-art technology to China at slave wages, near slave wages. In some cases, they were slave wages. They called them work-study programs, and they had youngsters working in China for nothing. But the imperialists brought with them the highest technology in the world. They went to China for a purpose. There's a worldwide recorded decline in the rate of profit in all capitalist industries, which we'll get to tomorrow. And in order to counter the inherent decline in the average rate of profit, Marx pointed out that a key factor is the super exploitation, as Robbie mentioned, of workers in the poorest countries, to the point where they work to death. But the Chinese had other intentions to be a permanent source of capitalist and imperialist profit. They used the technology to build their own factories. And they improved on those factories with state-of-the-art technologies that, in the course of 18 years, became competitive and exceeded the capacities of the imperialist corporations that started this process of bringing modern technology in every field. So today, China produces every conceivable commodity on a competitive basis in world markets, in world capitalist markets. Everything from farm equipment to high technology to nuclear technology to the most advanced state of telecommunications. Their new corporation, Huawei, is competitive, if not more competitive than Apple Computer, and probably outsells it in Europe as well. So when we wrote our political resolution at the last convention with regard to China's entry as a subordinate nation opening up its markets, and by the way, do you notice President Trump constantly criticizes for China for stealing our intellectual property? Yeah. What he means by that is they're using our technology that we put in their factories to their own advantage. And Trump wants them to continue to use the most primitive technology that is not competitive on world markets. So we wrote in our political resolution regarding the WTO and the imperialist idea that China is going to use the most inferior technology. Chinese capitalists had their own ideas. They estimated their agreements to temporarily subordinate their economies to the US and world imperialist investment in order to secure necessary initial foreign investment would in time allow them to participate on world markets as serious competitors. That time has come. Hence the Trump countermeasure tariffs aimed at perpetually keeping China as a second-rate player. we had a major article in our paper on these. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do it. You be quiet, because I need a quote from you. So, to continue the quote, obviously neither China nor any European nation or any self-respecting big-time capitalist entrepreneur intend to remain permanent second-rate players. As in the United States, all understand that their for-profit first and last systems depend both on their capacity to dominate world markets, to deepen the exploitation of old ones, and to simultaneously impose ever more noxious austerity measures on their own working masses, the ultimate source of wealth. In this context, imperialist wars, renewed colonization efforts, regime change efforts, as are the norm in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and intensified inter-imperialist rivalry are on the order of the day. And then we added to our political resolution an amendment that said, with regard to China, a major and growing imperialist power in its own right, but considerably less developed in key areas than the US, and Russia, a regional imperialist power of considerably less weight in the world economy, our analysis of their respective roles in the increasingly polarized world political situation, as with all other analyses, is subject to an examination of the facts and context at hand. Now, why did we put that in there? Well, if you put your finger on the magic button and say China's imperialist, the United States is imperialist, then with regard to every event on earth, you take a position saying we condemn both. We had a debate in our party on Syria. And with regard to the insertion of this statement, that with regard to every situation on earth, we must analyze the facts at hand. And with regard to Syria, we said, socialist action unconditionally supports Syria's right to self-determination, including its right to invite Russia and other nations to defend it against the intervention of the United States imperialist-led NATO, Turkey, and Gulf state monarchy coalition aimed at the Syrian government's overthrow. So we had a debate because the minority in our party, which recently left, said no, we can't take that position. We have to say with regard to Syria, Russia out now, and China out now, and Hezbollah out now, as well as US out now. And that caused us a 5-year debate in our party and some losses. We defended that position at 2 conventions, and then we had a debate on Nicaragua, when tens of thousands of people went into the streets to challenge the Ortega government, a capitalist government like Syria. Our minority started out by saying, down with Ortega. And we said we're required to analyze the facts at hand. And what we found in Nicaragua was that these mass mobilizations were organized by the Superior Council on Private Enterprise, by the Catholic Church, and right-wing student organizations that were meeting with Trump and others, as well as massive funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, NGOs, and other US imperialist organizations. And we concluded that the essence of what was happening in Nicaragua was a US orchestrated regime change against a regime that was capitalist and oppressive. And our line was US hands off Nicaragua, US out now. And then we came to Venezuela. What we saw there was a world-class imperialist, US imperialist coup. It was the most bold coup that anyone had seen in a lifetime. United States imperialists literally commandeered the gold and money in all of Venezuela's bank accounts around the world. They literally stole it and turned it over to the US appointed president, Juan Guaido, who they declared was the president of the country. And they organized a campaign to bribe and pay off Nicaragua's military to defect, saying if they did so, whatever crimes we have against them will be forgiven. And they organized massive armies to the east and west of Venezuela from Brazil and Colombia to invade the country, to supposedly bring needed healthcare, medical supplies. And they orchestrated people throwing Molotov cocktails to burn that medical supplies and broadcast it around the world to say that the Venezuelan government burned the food that was destined for the people. And it turned out the people who did that were part of the Guaido cabal. They literally paraded Guaido back into Venezuela, escorted by leading international capitalist diplomats, landing him at the Caracas airport and marching him into the country, declaring he was the president, daring the Maduro regime to arrest him. They said to every nation in Latin America and the world, if you trade a dime to Venezuela, we will cut you off and sanction like we do the other 54 nations on earth that don't do our bidding. In that context, our line in the United States was US hands off, US out now. And we initiated and organized the best protest we could in the low thousands of people to demand US out now. The minority in our party started with the proposition that Venezuela was capitalist, Maduro was a dictator, and he had to be overthrown. Just like some of their co-thinkers with regard to Bolivia last week said, no to Morales, no to Camacho. They had equal blame. And with regard to Venezuela, they pointed out that the Russians had provided medical and healthcare aid and medicines along with the Chinese, and the Russians were going to invest in Venezuela's oil facilities when the United States wanted to totally own and control them. So the line of our minority was to push the finger on the mechanical anti-imperialist button. Russia and China are imperialist. The United States is imperialist. A plague on both your houses. And they called on the workers to overthrow Maduro from the left. So these same forces that called themselves Trotskyists in Latin America organized trade unions and workers to develop a, quote, transitional program for the working class. And these same organizations that were supposedly pro-worker and against capitalist Maduro ended up supporting the Guaido government and supporting the coup. So these were severe debates with regard to Iran. The United States government sanctioned Iran, and the Trump administration threatened to obliterate the country, to interfere with every ship that Iran sent out of its nation to sell its own oil, the fourth largest oil producer in the world. They cyber warred its infrastructure, destroyed part of its computer systems, assassinated its scientists, and sanctioned it with the deepest sanctions anywhere in the world. And our line was US hands off Iran. Our minority's line, forgive me for bringing our internal dispute to yours, but it's in our newspaper, the new issue since the split. Minority's line was to attack Iranian capitalism, to attack Nicaraguan capitalism, Venezuelan capitalism, Syrian capitalism. In all of these cases, we supported the right of these poor, depressed nations to self-determination. That means to be free from US imperialist takeover, sanctions. That means to exercise that right and ask allies like Russia and China, or Hezbollah, or Iran, to help them. And when 2/3 of Syria was occupied by US-financed, organized, and paid armies, not just ISIS, US paid, financed armies, about to bomb Damascus to take it over, 2/3 of the country occupied by imperialist-backed forces, we supported the right of the Assad government to ask for help. And they did. Had they not received that help from Russia and Iran, the United States would be controlling the entire Syrian continent. With regard to the recent events in Syria. Nick, you might have helped me. I can't get rid of this thing. Let's see where that quote is. Nick knows how to push all these buttons. Come and help me. I pushed the photograph thing. That's it. You are aware of the fact that President Trump said he was going to withdraw from Syria. And we have a feature article on it in our newspaper. The Democrats, of course, the leading warmongering party in the United States, I better read this quote quick before it disappears, criticized Trump for abandoning the Kurds. That was not our position. We were for U.S. out now. And Trump changed his mind. He said he was just going to leave 100 troops in northeastern Syria to protect the oil. But then he said, in yesterday's New York Times, Nick can hold it up if you want, he said, we're keeping the oil. Mr. Trump said at the White House ahead of the meeting with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil. This is the fucking president of the United States.
At least he's honest, you know.
Jesus Christ. You know, the former, what's his name, head of the Federal Reserve, Nick, tell me his name. Alan Greenspan wrote a book on his life experience in the United States as head of the Federal Reserve, 1,000-page book. And in that book, there's a line where a reporter asks him, why did you invade Iran in 1953 and overthrow the elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh and impose the Shah, who set up the Savak, which is the CIA's death squad regime, and imprisoned 70,000 people. And Greenspan answered, you have to understand, there was an 800-pound gorilla in the room. Iran was the leading country in regard to oil reserves in the world, and for that, the United States considered it a national security question. Now, that was 70 years ago, and you had to read a 1,000-page book to get one line out of Alan Greenspan to say, we took over the country because of its oil. We took over the country because it was a national security question for American imperialism. And here is the fucking moron, Trump, and I use that word not to shock you, I'll tell you about that in a second, saying to the New York Times yesterday, we got the oil, it's ours. You know, he appointed, Trump, a Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. How many of you know who he is?
ExxonMobil.
He was the head of ExxonMobil. And Trump was, and they were in the middle of a National Security Council meeting in the United States, and Trump sachets in and says to his national security team, we have to increase our tactical nuclear weapons by 100-fold. I didn't say 100%. I said 100-fold more tactical nuclear weapons. And he left the room. And Tillerson said, the guy's a fucking moron. Not me, I didn't say that. I would not bring profanity into this sacred place. He is a fucking moron. But he's a capitalist moron who does exactly what's his name again from?
Greenspan?
What Alan Greenspan did 70 years ago, but quietly. They quietly dressed themselves up, the CIA, as Arabs and marched into the presidential palace and removed the president of the country. They did the same thing with Syria. They sent the armies of the world, a coalition of 12, 14 nations, including NATO. They financed ISIS. They created ISIS in Iran when they killed 1.5 million people and installed a government in that country where the United States still controls. What? Iraq. And installed a government in that country that so persecuted the Sunni minority that they went into revolt. And that was the origin of ISIS, the corrupt US-imposed government of that country for the oil. And the same thing with Bolivia. Their chief resource is natural gas. And US corporations wrote the contract in 2006 when Evo Morales was president to basically exploit the oil of the country. And Pence, the vice president, and Pompeo literally talk about how US corporations are needed to exploit Venezuela's oil. Openly. We want the goddamn oil. So, are we in a contradictory position where we say that oppressed nations have the right to self-determination? Everybody on the left today is saying US hands off Bolivia. No US intervention. This is a fascist-like coup. Although every corporate newspaper in the United States says, well, you see, it's he really stole the elections, Morales did, he didn't get the 10% above the other person. It's all lies, which we've exposed. But this brutal regime, with the backing of the United States, went through that country and murdered and tortured indigenous people. They said to Morales, if you don't sign this resignation, we're going to kill your sister. And they burned her house down. They took governors and they stripped them naked, painted them red, and paraded them through the street, barefoot, demanding that they denounce the government. They say that Morales resigned. How many of you would resign with a bullet to your head, as opposed to being a martyr saying, kill me? So US imperialism is the prime beast. China, to my knowledge, doesn't have any foreign military bases outside its border. One, okay. Guess how many the United States has? 1,100. Russia has 6 in its former USSR. The United States has 1,100. The US military spends $1 trillion a year, which is more than the entire world combined. Now, going back to Bolivia, I could say, hey, wait a second. China signed a contract with the Evo Morales regime for the development of its lithium. It's the world's richest lithium deposits in the country, and the Chinese are paying $2.5 billion. Shouldn't we say, hey, wait a second, this is not really a US-supported coup. We should condemn the Chinese for exploiting, with a $2.5 million investment, the lithium of a poor country. Well, let's talk about that. Does investment by Russia or China mean that they're imperialist automatically? You know, the Russians, prior to the 1917 revolution, tried to get American corporations to invest in Russia. It was a destroyed country after 17 nations invaded it. They desperately needed it, and they got help from American millionaires who were billionaires at that time, who would be billionaires today. Like, how many of you have ever heard of Arm & Hammer? He was a major investor in Russia, and they welcomed his investment. They pleaded for investment because nobody else would. Did they control more or less, sometimes more and sometimes less, the nature of foreign investment? What should any poor nation on earth do today to develop its resources when it doesn't have the capacity to do it itself? Every nation on earth that's poor has to go to a country with the resources, the machinery, the technology, the oil wells, the drilling, the transportation, the science, the purification, in order to develop its resources. The president of Chad said, we in Chad totally nationalized our entire oil industry. And we signed contracts for its development in Chad, and after 10 years we haven't seen 5 cents. Because all of these contracts that are made start with the proposition that you can nationalize anything you want in a hole in the ground, but in order to bring it up, you need pipelines, you need oil wells, you need drilling facilities, you need transportation, you need refineries, you need scientists, you need market relations, none of which are in the reach of any poor nation. So they're all forced. I have a thing, an article that thick on the nature of these oil contracts. And every one of them signed by every nation on earth basically takes the lion's share, which is exactly what the Trump administration wants to do with regard to Venezuela or Iran. The United States organized a fascist-led coup in the Ukraine. When the Ukraine decided to take a deal from Russia, which was less onerous than the European Union offered it to bail it out and avoid the worst aspects of austerity. So in the Maidan, you had people like, what's his name, ran for president, John, the military guy? McCain went there, and U.S. Top officials gave cookies out to them. John McCain spoke at fascist platforms in the Maidan. And the United States orchestrated that coup. We've written about it in our joint newspaper, Socialist Action. They orchestrated that coup. What was it about? The United States fundamentally couldn't compete with Russia, whose pipelines went directly to supply most of Western Europe oil and gas. And Eastern Ukraine was the source of one of the largest, natural gas sources, and the United States wanted to frack the Eastern Ukraine. So they orchestrated a coup in order to do that, to bypass Russia, who was underselling it because of transportation and other questions. Russia's major export is fossil fuel.
5 minutes, Jeff.
So, how important is this question of the right of self-determination of poor and oppressed nations? Well, for us as revolutionaries, if we want to win any credibility of the masses in Venezuela, or any nation on earth that is attacked by U.S. imperialism, our comrades have to be in the forefront of the fight against the imperialist intervention. And not in the other camp, God forbid, where we're saying Russia out now, and we say it's a civil war in Syria between the massive Syrian people and the dictatorship of the butcher Assad. No. The polls that Gallup's organization in London conducted in Syria, which you'll never hear about in the United States, said that 10% of the population or less support the so-called rebels, and a majority support the Assad regime. How many of you ever heard of that poll? Just a handful of people. But the American people never heard about that. They blamed the murder of 500,000 Syrians and the dispossession of half the population on the Assad government, not on the concerted effort of imperialism to overthrow that regime. The same thing with Libya. We had to invade Libya with United Nations support in order to stop Gaddafi from murdering 50,000 people in Benghazi. How many of you heard that? That was a pretext. And we leveled that country. And guess who ended up with the oil? In this failed state, United States corporations. That country is ruined. And the same thing with every other country on earth. That's why I quoted Trump. We got the oil. We steal the wealth. And the same thing with Bolivia and elsewhere. So what was our position when imperialism invaded Syria or Libya or supported the coup in Egypt? The United States backed the coup that brought al-Sisi to power, murdered 12,000 people in the democratically elected government of Mohamed Morsi. We opposed the coup. So we put in our political resolution, yes, we consider them imperialist on a lesser scale, and we didn't apply a universal formula. With regard to Hong Kong, we sided with the masses in Hong Kong against the Chinese government, who wanted to use this legislation to extradite people who they said were criminals. But we have some experience in that country because we've had Trotskyist comrades in Hong Kong who have been imprisoned and sent back when the British run the country and are still in Chinese jails today. We have no confidence in Chinese capitalism as being progressive, and the idea that China's a worker state that exploits teenage women at 6 cents an hour in factories across the country and is part of the World Trade Organization and has the second largest economy. The idea that that's a worker state is a joke. It's a capitalist imperialist state that wants to be what the United States is, that has major investments in Africa. The Russians have minor investments nowhere outside of the Soviet Union, Russia, and a few other places. But they're capitalist imperialist regimes. But our evaluation of them has to be a bit different. When I was a kid, I used to go to sleep like this and look at a giant Rand McNally map, almost half the size of that, of Africa, when I was like 12 years old. And since I had nothing else to do but listen to the Lone Ranger on the radio or some other radio program, I looked at the map and it said French Equatorial Africa, Spanish Sahara, it's a Portuguese Angola, British, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. And every country had an imperialist name on it. The entire continent was carved up among imperialisms. The colonization of Africa was the first time in the history of the human race that the population of a continent declined because of millions murdered. They say that the Holocaust against the Jews by Hitler, 6 million, was the worst in the world. King Leopold killed 12 million people in the Congo. 12 million, with the similar proportional numbers across Africa as the imperialists depopulated that country, either exporting them as slaves or murdering them in the process of taking their lands and wealth. To this day, that exploitation continues, 99% by the US imperialist powers and their NATO allies. China, although increasingly has a role there, there's nothing comparable to the kind of division in the imperialist world that led to World War I and II, a redivision of the entire planet. So this question of self-determination cuts to the heart of revolutionary policy. If our comrades cannot defend the oppressed peoples against imperialist intervention, they can't win any credibility to make a revolution in that country. They can't win over the working class. During the Chinese Revolution of 1949, in 1936, Japan, imperialist Japan, invaded China. And the Chiang Kai-shek government basically wanted to make a compromise with the Chinese to allow Japan to colonize it. And Mao Zedong led the opposition. Stalinist aside, he formed an army to challenge the Japanese imperialist intervention. And at one point, there was a special incident called the Hsian Incident, H-S-I-A-N, where Chinese Communist Party troops literally captured Chiang Kai-shek. Physically. How many of you knew about that? And they captured him and they said, listen, if you stop fighting us and you fight the Japanese, we'll let you go. Were they unprincipled to do that? Chiang Kai-shek had major armies to fight the Japanese imperialists. In each and every one of these countries, a failure to analyze the concrete situation that we're facing leads to disaster.
1 minute.
We tried to avoid that disaster for 5 years and weren't unable to do so. So we had a split. The split was over this question of Russia and Chinese imperialism out now. It was over the right of oppressed nations to self-determination. And by the time the split was over, literally a month ago, every comrade knew what it was, and we lost 28 people, which we didn't want to lose, which we gave 5 years of full democratic rights and representation in our party at every level. A third of our national committee and political committee, and the editor of our paper were comrades in the minority. But their differences were so severe that they could not be constrained within the ranks of our party, and they started publishing their ideas in other publications. But they were members of our party, and they disgraced themselves in the anti-war movement by basically calling for the downfall of Maduro during the U.S. coup. And people said, well, isn't this person a member of your party? And we had to say yes, but we disagree on that question. So I did not take on the job of, in detail, relating 45 pages of Chinese banks and its standing in regard to direct foreign investment in other countries, its comparison with other imperialist countries. But the facts are there. But the facts notwithstanding does not free us from the responsibility of evaluating how we apply our theory to the concrete situation in every country. I'll close on Kashmir. The Indian government invaded Kashmir, tore up its autonomy resolution, slaughtered 5,000 people who they found in graves, took over Kashmiri land, and the whole world said, India out, US hands off. Our minority said, all regional powers out. They wanted Pakistan, an ally of China, to get out of Kashmir, which it had not invaded. They wanted China to get out of Kashmir, which had not invaded. They mechanically applied a formula that had no relation to reality, denying the Kashmiris their right to self-determination. Kashmiris across the world, and in Toronto, you had a demonstration. What was the slogan? India out now. Canada hands off. Did you say Pakistan out now?
No.
Jesus Christ, who would understand that? So we live in a complicated world, but the imperialist beast, as I said by Trump, is alive and well. But let me close with this. Trump's policies are no different than the policies of the US ruling class. Trump is a pacifist regarding war with the Democratic Party, condemning him for withdrawing from Syria. He had to back off and say, we got the oil, don't worry. And the same thing with Iran, you know. He negotiates with North Korea. The Democrats condemn him. The Democrats blame him for stealing the goddamn election. All lies. the American government spends $8 billion a year on its election. And when I'm elected president, we'll put an end to that. Can I have another 2 minutes to talk about my campaign a little bit?
Cost you another bottle of wine.
Okay. I've already paid $5 in US for that Cuban bottle of rum. And I fully intend to win it.
2 minutes, not negotiable.
But, so I'm running for President of the United States, and I get a phone call from a publication called the Atlantic Monthly. Have you heard of it? Yeah. And I said, gee, I'm glad to give you an interview. And they said, well, so they interviewed me for an hour. And then they said, I'll tell you why they interviewed me. They said, you know, people think Bernie Sanders is a socialist. No way. If you want to know what a full fat, I don't know why'd they say fat for me. But they said, if you want to know what a full fat socialist, you take socialist action. Like Bernie Sanders, he's just for small cuts in the military budget, while Jeff Macklin is for the elimination of the military budget. Well, that got us some votes, you know. And then they said, well, you take, you know, Elizabeth Warren, she has a wealth tax where she wants to tax the wealth over $50 million at the rate of 2%. That is, you don't get any tax on your wealth of 50 million, just 2% if you get 52 million, 60 million, billion. Bernie Sanders has a sliding scale. If you're a billionaire, he wants to tax 3% of your wealth. Oh. Whereas Jeff Backler wants to eliminate the whole goddamn wealth. Yeah. He wants to take it away. But why did they give a revolutionary socialist a platform? And then it was followed up by that Vice Media, interviewed for the same reason. Did you ever hear Vice Media? Yeah. They interviewed me for the same reason. They gave me a terrific interview. They called me a Trotskyist, you know. And they went and they wanted to convince their liberal audiences that the Democrats were safe. They were not real socialists. You want the real thing, that's, you know, he'll take your ass to the cleaner. Bernie, he's, you know, he's safe. And Bernie's part of the warmongering party. Bernie signed a pact like he did in 2016 saying whatever Democrat wins, he'll support.
He did.
And there's no difference between any of them. The only difference is the Democrats want to pose as intellectual imperialists. They want to orchestrate the media and the New York Times to read like concern for humanity, as opposed to the racist bigot that they are. But Obama presided over the deportation of 2.5 million people. Obama orchestrated the war in Iraq, where was Syria. Obama bombed Syria under the pretext that he used poison gas, which is exposed as a lie. And the Democrats voted for every war budget ever. Yes. They just are embarrassed when a crude fucking moron like Trump says what the imperialists really mean. They're embarrassed. But mark my word, there is no qualitative difference other than the embarrassment factor and competing interests within the U.S. government. Obama, what's his name? One more sentence and I'm gone. Trump, you know, took something like 276 lobbyists and he put them in his administration. As opposed to having to lobby a congressman, they are now writing the laws directly, which they did before under the Democrats. They always wrote the laws and the tax laws. They didn't need the lobbyists because they had the government, which is capitalist. But Trump is so crude as to be embarrassing. But he is no different than any of the other capitalist candidates. Thank you.
Okay, comrades, there will be no Q&A because the American Socialists used up all the time. Okay, so we're going to open the floor for questions or interventions, and we have up to 3 minutes. 3 minutes each for a question or yeah, that's it. 3 minutes each, and then we will take some questions, and then we'll come. What's going on? Keep talking. We'll come back to the panel. Okay, so I saw some ads. Just a minute. hands up. Yeah, I got you, sister. All right, do you want to be on the list as well? Okay, you're next then. Okay, Kurt.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, I agree with both your presentations, especially the one of Jeff's. I do agree that China is a rising imperialist power while Russia is a regional imperialist power. I just wanted to go over some of the things that I know about China that have led me to that perspective. China is currently outsourcing factories to Ethiopia and Vietnam due to the rising wages within China. It has a military base in Djibouti, which is on the Horn of Africa, and it is invested in foreign countries in order to gain control over strategically important locations. One of their biggest efforts is called the Belt and Road Initiative. But when it comes to condemning the role of imperialism around the world, we do need to put it in perspective, as Jeff Mackler has said. China's imperialist actions around the world has not led to the outright massacre of millions of people, while America's has. If China is investing into a country, I can perceive a future in which China will make those, take those efforts, those military efforts, but they currently do not have that power, and it would probably be decades before they do, while the United States is currently murdering millions of people around the world. So I think in our condemnation of imperialism, we always need to side with protecting the people, because if we want a socialist revolution, we have to understand that United States intervention within any country will lead to the murder of people with our perspectives first and foremost. They will kill all leftist people, and for us to see Trotskyists or any socialist around the world siding with the United States and aiding them in their regime change efforts is utterly disgusting, because they will be the first people to be murdered.
Okay, Marcy, it's the sister right here and then you, right here.
Okay.
Over here. The red.
Oh, my turn. Oh, okay. So I have two questions, but I'll do only, okay. I have two questions, but I'll do only one, and then if there's time. So thank you both for a very insightful and inspiring presentations. I'm glad you made the point, because, I mean, probably because I agree, that at the end of the day, there is no qualitative difference between the policies of the Democrats and the Republicans. And I lived many years in the United States. I wasn't born there. I'm originally from South America. Although there's a difference in style, right? I follow very closely Glenn Ford, whom you probably know, and his classic assertion is that the Democrats, and particularly Obama, was the most effective of two evils, rather than the lesser, right? Mm-hmm. Most effective because it put a significant percentage of the liberal, progressive, whatever you want to call it, to sleep, essentially, right? He was carrying out the same policies, but people did not react in the same way. So I was kind of wondering, I was a bit taken aback that it seemed to me that you still, made the sort of the almost obligatory point of, what an idiot Trump is and whatever, blah, 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 blah. And I've myself got to a point where I find it quite tiring when I see the Trump bashing thing. I think, well, he's so facile. I mean, of course, he's not to be in polite company, or you won't take him to a cocktail party. Or we know that, right? But it's been such a distraction from what's actually happening concerning, American imperialism and exploitation of the American people as well, right? So I'm kind of wondering, because you seem to recognize that, and at the same time what I understood is that you were sort of emphasizing, what an idiot he is, and I wanted to see if you could elaborate on that point. Thank you.
Okay, YC?
Jeff, thank you so much for being a Golden State Warriors fan. I'm from Toronto, and I quite admire Steve Kerr. And if people haven't read about him, he's a wonderful human interest
You
story.
can leave now.
And he's the son of Malcolm Kerr. Okay, so anyway, my question to you, Jeff, is I know you mentioned Hong Kong briefly, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on Hong Kong and where we should go for accurate facts and also human interest stories, because from what I understood, the extradition law stemmed from a murder, not in Hong Kong, but in Taiwan, and the criminal fled back to Hong Kong, and apparently he's walking free. So I just want to know your position on human rights in Hong Kong and the situation there, because there's so much disinformation out there in the corporate mainstream media. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that. And the other, I just have one quick question because I just got it on myself. And for those who don't know me, I'm a musician, and I have an accompanist that I like very much, who I work with. She just texted me. She said, "Hey, my son, he's 12, and I want to recommend a book for him. What do you recommend?" I'm thinking maybe Brave New World. So, I don't know, to offer the hope to a 12-year-old boy, who is the son of my accompanist, what would you recommend for the youngsters who I want to encourage to become socialists in the future?
Okay, I'm going to take two more speakers. Yes, I got everybody's hand. Yeah, I got you too, but we're going to have to wait. We can only have so many speakers and then come back to the panel. So I have two more, Barry and then John O. And then I have, once the panel is finished, then we'll come back to my list, okay? Barry.
Good evening, everyone. After the coup in Bolivia, shares in Tesla and a Canadian mining corporation, name escapes me, went way up. This is all about lithium. Bolivia apparently has, they claim 70% of the reserves of lithium, and if you know anything about batteries, lithium is involved, heavily involved. And the government of Evo Morales had a bad habit of trying to take into public ownership control of the mining, the mineral resources of the country. Whether this was done completely or fully or properly is something we can discuss, but it rankled the imperialists, including the Canadian imperialists. But we have to understand the character of the group in the country that has taken power away from the elected government. Camacho is an ultra-religious Nazi freak. I mean, he is a really blood-curdling, horrible, horrible person. And to give you an idea of what he represents, his party has now, because the Evo Morales party, the MAS, is not able to attend meetings of the Senate for fear of their lives, his party's head of state, head of the Senate, said, and I quote, "The satanic Indians don't belong in the cities. They should go back to the coca fields." This gives you like a blood-curdling sense of the harm that they intend on the indigenous majority of that Latin American country. Now, Trudeau and Freeland, they support the coup in Bolivia, just as they supported the coup attempt in Venezuela with Guaido.
Shame.
And that's not just because they've made a mistake or they just don't understand the ramifications of what they're saying. They're fully in line with the interests of the Canadian mining corporations, Canadian imperialism, junior partner of American imperialism. What about Jagmeet Singh? Well, days and days went by, and nothing but the sound of crickets. Where did he stand? Well, finally, yesterday, Jagmeet Singh said there was a coup, and the NDP is against coup d'etat in any country. Wouldn't say that about Venezuela when Jagmeet Singh was running for a seat in Parliament in the by-election in Burnaby South. He was asked by a reporter, "Who's the president of Venezuela?" And his answer, you remember? I don't know. It's up to the people to decide. People of Venezuela. Well, the people of Venezuela had an election a year before that, and Maduro won against 3 rivals by a wide margin. But after the fact, that wasn't to the liking of imperialism, so they wouldn't recognize it. And Jagmeet Singh didn't know who the president of Venezuela was. Maybe he does now. So this clearly sets out our task. Our task as socialists, anti-imperialists, democratically minded people is to build solidarity with the people of Venezuela and the people of Bolivia against these threats that they face, because our corporations want to extract as much profit as they possibly can from the resource base of that country. Now, I'm happy to say, what do I have, a minute left? Happy to say that
30 seconds.
we are among the majority of the world. And we got a real sense of that. Kurt and I went to a conference in Havana, Cuba, just about a week and a half ago. And it was one of the most inspiring things that we've ever witnessed, right? There were 1,300 plus people in attendance from 85 countries, and they stood up against imperialism and neoliberalism and for the revolt that we see increasingly cascading around the world. We've seen rebellions in Ecuador, in Chile, it's ongoing, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in places all around the world against the neoliberal agenda. And I just want to quote in conclusion what occurred in the final session of that momentous gathering in Havana, Cuba. Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro was there, and he invoked the spirit of Fidel Castro. He declared that within and beyond Latin America, quote, a general uprising is occurring against neoliberalism and capitalism. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel said that his people will continue to confront the United States' economic, commercial, and financial blockade in all fields with work, creativity, resistance, and without renouncing development. Cuba's most valuable resource is its people, imaginative, enterprising, brave, and creative. The tightening of U.S. sanctions is an admission by Washington that the vast majority of Cubans support socialism, so the imperialists resort to fomenting economic dissatisfaction. But he said, Cuba will never surrender. He quoted Jose Marti, the 19th century founder of Cuban independence movement, quote, kindness and beauty cannot be bought. Cuba's president summarized the weekend with these words, only the socialist project can achieve social justice. Youth are rising. Cuba has diplomatic relations with 160 countries. We defeated the free trade agreement of the Americas. Cuba's solidarity with Venezuela, and I add, with Bolivia, will remain steadfast, and so will ours.
Woo. John O. in the back there, and then we're coming back to the panel.
Okay, now my question is, I guess, mostly directed for Robbie. You know, when we think of imperialist countries, we kind of think of, well, the U.S. and France and England and perhaps Italy. But my question is, I'm going to put out some names here: ArcelorMittal, Embraer, Vale, Samsung, Hyundai. These are huge multinational countries that are from Brazil, India, the largest steel company in the world, India-Luxembourg joint company, Samsung and Hyundai from South Korea. So my question is, you have these giant formations of capital, multinational corporations, and they're all over the world. Are they running into, are the confines of the state hindering their development? In other words, what is free trade? Isn't free trade trying to get beyond national boundaries and where the multinational companies have access to places all over the world? So I just want you to comment on the conflict between the nation state and multinational corporations. And just one other example is right now, the president of the U.S., he's fighting, it would appear, for workers in the USA, and he's fighting against, Ford and GM, saying bring the jobs home. So he acts as though he's a nationalist against multinationals. There is all these conflicts, so just comment on them if you would. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to go back to the panel. They have up to 6 minutes to try and answer some of these questions. And
Unfair.
No, it's okay. They've got their
They got their own mic there, okay. And so we'll start with Jeff and then go to Robbie. So, and I'm going to keep you guys to your time, 6 minutes each.
Okay, thanks.
Do you want to hold the mic or you want?
Yeah.
Just hold it. Okay.
Thanks, everybody, for your questions. Kurt, I agree. And in fact, China, with its minimum wage now, in order to support this middle class that purchases its commodities, is pricing itself at $2.50 an hour on average minimum wage, is pricing itself out of world markets. So countries that used to invest big capital in China are going to Vietnam, Indonesia, and India for cheaper labor. And the Chinese are becoming less competitive, and their growth rate is slowing. It's caught in the vicious cycle of capitalist imperialist development. China is perfectly capable of supporting dictators around the world, which it does in some African countries, and it finances some of their armies. And it will not be long until China begins to do the horrors that the United States does blatantly. But today, it's a matter of quality versus quantity. U.S. imperialism, in my opinion, is responsible for 500,000 deaths in Syria. 1.5 million people in Iraq during the war there. Tens of thousands in Libya. And everywhere else in the world. As far as, I didn't get your name, but in the red shirt.
Claudia.
I agree that it's easy to take a cheap shot at Trump, because he's an idiot. You know, and by the way, people in the United States are tiring of this, saying, I don't want to talk politics, all I hear is Trump, Trump, Trump. Because he's an easy target, and because the corporate media fosters the idea that he's a moron, which is what the New York Times does. Trump stopped subscribing to the New York Times because they were attacking him mercilessly on a personal basis. And when they attacked him politically, it was always to the right, not that he has a left bone in his body. But so I agree. And our campaign is not about demonizing Trump and calling him names. It's about saying we're running against both capitalist parties and explaining why. As far as Hong Kong is concerned, they say that Hong Kong, the Chinese government says it's one country, two systems. There's no alternative system in China. It's a capitalist, imperialist country. And it wants to place Hong Kong, which used to be a world center of British and European imperialist investment. They want Hong Kong to people to be more subordinate to the Chinese imperialists. The demonstrations, and we had an article and a new one coming in the next issue of the paper by a Hong Kong comrade, his name is Lam Chi, and he supports our view. He supported the protest, but he said they're largely not political. They're for basic democratic rights against deportation, extradition. But the Hong Kong working class, which is among the most exploited in the world and poverty-stricken, has not had a role in these mobilizations because there is no leadership with them. Barry's right about lithium. I wouldn't be surprised if we learn in the years to come that the United States basically gave the green light to the coup because they didn't want the Chinese to have the lithium. That's a possibility. The last question I'm going to leave to Robbie and all the others, but I want to make one point which I haven't made, and this is a very serious point. Why is it that the Ortegas and the Moraleses and the Maduros, why is it that all of these social democratic types, pink revolution types, who basically head their countries on the one hand, and Brazil, Lula, every one of them presides over a capitalist economy. In Venezuela and Brazil, the vast amounts of land still belong to private enterprises. The banks and corporations are owned by capitalism. They're not socialist countries, all the rhetoric aside. Why? What's wrong with these people? Are they ideologically incompetent? Don't they understand that they can't develop their country in the framework of capitalism? How do you explain it over and over again? Well, we say we need to build revolutionary socialist parties that challenge capitalist prerogative. But why do they make these decisions? And I'll tell you my personal opinion. When the Nicaraguans made a revolution in 1979, we had a debate in our party, our previous party, Socialist Workers' Party. And the Socialist Workers' Party abandoned its principle of permanent revolution and basically went along with the Ortega regime to not follow the Cuban road and give the land to the peasants and nationalize the wealth of the country. Why did they do that? Why did Maduro follow the same path? Ortega, every one of them. And I'll tell you my personal reasons. The Earth's ruling class sent its best representatives to these countries and said, if you touch our land, if you nationalize our factories, we'll sanction you, we'll invade you, we'll embargo you, we'll assassinate you, we'll blockade your ports, and we'll starve you to death, and we'll send Contra armies in to overthrow you. That's what they say. So they say, you better find a middle road, and they all try to find a middle road of making a revolution without making a revolution. As the Cubans told me when I visited, you can't make half a revolution. So they had a young Fidel Castro, who was a lawyer, was a member of one of the traditional opposition capitalist parties, the Orthodox Party. He made a revolution, came to the United States, and my dad and I were sitting back watching Fidel on television on the Ed Sullivan Show. Raise your hand if you ever heard of the Ed Sullivan Show. I mean, this was like a comedy show. He was a right-wing Daily News reporter who had the Beatles on. He had elephants walking on balls. He had Elvis Presley and so on. And he announces to the audience, ladies and gentlemen of America, I'd like to introduce you to Fidel Castro, the George Washington of Cuba. And everybody applauded. They figured Fidel's just another George Washington. And he was welcomed. They didn't think he'd do anything. And when the government that came into power immediately after, his bourgeois associates, refused to give the land to the peasants, Fidel said, that's why we made the revolution. And he broke with them and gave the land to the peasants in the biggest land reform in the history of the world outside of the Russian Revolution. And when the United States invaded to say, and then they said to him, don't have these public trials in stadiums with 30,000 people where you're going to judge Batista's murderers. You can't do that. You have to have democracy. You have to have fair trial. They wanted Fidel to send the army to stop the people from murdering the butchers of Batista. Al perdón, they said, por los terroristas. And Fidel didn't. And then they invaded. And Fidel's response was, we are going to nationalize the capitalist class down to the nails in the boots of their shoes. And he fundamentally transformed the entire Cuban economy. None of the others have dared to do so. They don't want to suffer what Cuba suffered. 50 years, 60 years of isolation, embargo, 37, 45 attempts of Fidel's life. And even the Cubans cautioned, hey, you don't have to take our road. When the Grenadians tried to take that road, the Stalinist Bernard Cord murdered the head of that country, who was a comrade of ours, Maurice Bishop. So it takes guts to make a revolution, and it takes a revolutionary party. And these mostly honest leaders like Maduro and Chavez, they want to do good. Morales, their poverty rate is decreased. They set up 2.5 million housing projects in Venezuela when oil prices were high. But it takes a different kind of revolutionary, an internationalist like we are, a group with parties in every country, like we try to be, to challenge capitalist rule and take the consequences. And the only way to victory is to unite these countries in one fighting fist against the imperialist machine worldwide. So that's my view.
Thanks. Well, I have to say that I remain to be convinced that China is a rising imperialist power, nor for that matter that Russia is a regional imperialist power. So I think we have to proceed with caution on this question. And it's not because of any wish to defend the sweating of teenage female labor in China, or for that matter, the egregiously reactionary positions that China takes in its foreign policy, such as supporting the suppression of the Tamil rebellion in Sri Lanka. But this is very much consistent with Chinese foreign policy under Mao and his extremely opportunist and reactionary support for the Pinochet dictatorship, etc. So I don't see this as definitive. It's hard to mount this position, I concede, in the midst of the very eloquent and the moral fervor, really, with which we need to denounce these abuses. But we are also compelled to analyze things somewhat dispassionately as Marxists. It's sometimes hard to marry that with our passion, but I don't think the two should be confused. So I'm interested in Kurt's information about Chinese exploitation of cheap labor in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, I think you said, and I'd like to see the references for that, because certainly this is not cast in stone. I think that it's possible that China may emerge as an imperialist power. I just don't think it's happened yet. And the evidence shows that China has been a major contributor over the last 25 years, or close to that, to the net transfer of wealth from the semi-colonial world, the poor countries of the world, to the rich capitalist imperialist powers, imperialist societies. China is actually responsible for a substantial portion of that transfer of wealth. We need to look at the evidence, whether that is now a thing of the past. Are we now seeing a transfer of wealth in the other direction? Well, some Marxists argue that, David Harvey notably. I think this is an ongoing question that we have to examine. The question of the conflict between nation states and multinational corporations, in other words, I'm not sure what you're driving at, John, but I presume you're wondering if I would agree with the fact that multinational corporations have now severed their connection to the nation states from which they originated. I don't believe that to be the case. Although, again, there are some sections of the Marxist left who argue that, such as William Robinson, who thinks that there is a transnational capitalist class now that is not anchored in particular imperialist nation states. I don't tend to think that reflects reality. Well, I think that's about it for now. I agree with you about the Trump bashing. It's very tempting, of course, but I find myself tiring of this as well with my discussions and debates with outraged liberals and social democrats mostly, of whom I number some in my friendship group, and it does get a bit tiring. Like, come on, grapple with reality. What's really going on here, and what does Trump represent? And is this the world's most important horror show? I don't think so. So I sympathize with your point entirely, Claudia. That's about it.
Okay, we're going to go back to the list. We have, I think, 6 speakers on it right now. So I don't know. We'll see when we get through. The next speaker is Gary, and then the next is you.
Che Guevara once said, "Those who tremble with indignation at every injustice are comrades of mine." And, I think when you start studying imperialism based on facts, and you figure out what the United States and other imperialist powers actually do, and the millions that they have murdered for profit, that's what prompted me to think of Che Guevara. I want to say a couple of words about three things. One is trade deals, another is Canadian imperialism, and then maybe two things. That'll take all the time. Trade deals are not free trade deals. Free trade deals are negotiations among the imperialists for access to capital, access to markets, and also, more recently, to try to establish the power of global corporations over national governments so that they can sue a government who tries to limit their abilities by imposing restrictions for the safety of their own population, imposing restrictions for the protection of their own indigenous peoples, anything like that. These deals give these global corporations the right to sue governments. So there's nothing to do with free trade here. Also, they do not protect the environment. They do not protect labor. It's all a deal among the imperialists. And we oppose them. Simple as that. The other thing is Canadian imperialism. I just want to say, I think even our people, our own members, are not as familiar as they should be. Canada is the world's, the Toronto Stock Exchange is the largest stock exchange for mining organizations in the world. And that's because Canada is an easy place for mining corporations to operate. The Ontario Securities Commission is very mild and lukewarm in monitoring their foreign operations. And what do? Well, they murder Indigenous people. They hire American mercs, they're called, mercenaries, to protect their territory. So, for example, in Burkina Faso,
Burkina Faso.
Yeah. There was an attack on a Canadian convoy. There were no Canadians there. It was all local Africans who were being brought in to work in the mines, and it was protected by arms. But people from the country next north of it, who's, I'm getting tired because I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning to get here. So there was 39 killed and 100 wounded, and that was all Africans. No Canadians got hurt. And the Canadians fly in and out. But this mine is a gold mine, and what it did was move 17,000 local people off who lived, eked out an existence by hand tool mining to get a little gold. And on that basis, that mine would have lasted for decades and decades, and they would have made a living. They moved them all off, brought 2,000 back in to work under very difficult conditions, and they expect to consume all the gold to produce
30 seconds.
By 2025, and then leave it in an ecological and human ruin, as they always do, and fly off back after dropping off the profits in a tax haven to fly back to Canada. So that's the nature, and many of the largest mining operations in the world are based here, and they have a terrible. Canada is becoming known outside of here, where the Canadian population has fed a line of BS about what good people we are and how we're nice people. They are murderers and exploiters and polluters on a grand scale. So Canadian imperialism is a vicious, that's what Trudeau represents. That's what Scheer represents. And it's something that Jagmeet Singh, in his own way, represents. Because he doesn't want to overthrow capitalism, he wants to reform it. And as long as you keep it, that's what it's going to be.
Thank you, Gary. Right behind you, Gary.
Good evening. I'm Tynan from QP Local 2 TTC Electrical Workers. We recently had a busy 3 months campaigning for free public transit and reaching out to the rest of the labor movement for strikes and mass protests to bring down the Ford regime. As you may have noticed, that has not transpired. But we gave it a hell of a shot. And I wanted to thank Socialist Action for organizing the meeting and for endorsing our campaign. I'm not a supporter of the organization, but I think you can understand when you're a communist in your union, you're constantly trying to connect the day-to-day struggles of the working class to the historic goal of a workers' government. And when you're in the unions, you can get really bogged down in the details of the day-to-day struggle, so it's very important to have meetings like this where we can speak about the great goal, about communism, about the historic tasks of the working class, to ultimately create a society where private property, the state, and the family are abolished, and have open discussions about the full range of strategic questions that poses. So first, I wanted to, recognize that Socialist Action seems to have gone through a healthy split on the Syrian question. You guys have a setback ahead of you, but your position seems stronger now against adaptation to your own ruling class, and that opens up the door for future growth. But what I wanted to talk about is China. And as a starting off point, there's that really moving poem at the beginning of tonight's proceedings by Giovanni Riccio, talking about what happened with the Oshawa closure. That plant was the beating heart of the proletariat here in Ontario. It used to employ 23,000 people in its prime in the 80s. Now all we're going to get out of this is 300 jobs. And the wages, there was give back after give back in order to keep jobs here. And every time the wages came down and the benefits were cut, the jobs became fewer and fewer. And what I want to contrast that to, what it needs to be contrasted to, is China, which is the only major country on earth where the industrial working class has been steadily growing larger and more wealthy. 850 million people in China. 850 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty in the past 4 decades. Jeff, you made a point, you talked about teenage women being exploited for 6 cents an hour in factories across the country. Now, you were speaking for a long time, and I understand sometimes it's easy for things to slip and whatnot, but wages for auto workers in China have recently overtaken those of workers in the Balkans. The working class in China is getting larger and wealthier. And the reason is, it's a fundamentally different economy there. It represents a more advanced form of society, where production, however distorted it is by capitalist factors, is based on maximizing output. Whereas in a capitalist country, output maximizes only when profits can increase, and output contracts when profits decline. China has no such cyclical boom and bust cycles. There is capital, but it is subordinated by the Chinese Communist Party, and businessmen are forced to run their businesses at a loss. The law of value is subordinated to the production of use. And just as a particularly dramatic sign of how capitalists in China, they're the economically dominant class, but they're not the socially and politically dominant class, is that they get executed all the time. 17% of Chinese billionaires have been dragged into court, many of them end up in prison, and plenty of them get blown away, which is just completely the opposite of what we have here, where it's poor people and dark-skinned people, workers that get crushed by the state. So is it socialism? No, but it just represents the social foundations of a future classless society and should be defended against imperialism.
Thank you. Okay. Woo. Right at the back, yes.
Hi, I'm Luis Angel, and first of all, I have 2 questions, but I want to say thank you both for a great speech. I liked it. Now, I like the fact that you mentioned the monetary and financial system. We all know that banks are one of the what do you call it, fundamentals of capitalism, right? And it's a pillar. So we're talking about imperialism, and we know the role of the petrodollar and why the U.S. Politicians they say they're against dictators, yet they have really good businesses with Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Kingdom. So we know that there's a contract there with the petrodollar, and the dollar is the dominant monetary paper piece of international trade. So, and we know that wars, and because the U.S. has a strong arm when it comes to the military-industrial complex, but then they're both playing the same game with the Fed, which I'm pretty sure most of us here know that they know that there's a bubble, and they should soon have an economic crisis, but then they're just disguising it, and they keep on feeding with the interest rates, etc. So it's a game that they're both playing, the military-industrial complex, the IMF, World Bank, and all these banking systems, with along with the sanctions that the U.S. plays. So Iran, Turkey, China, Russia, they're ditching the dollar, and now they're trying to do trading with the local money, and they're buying a lot of reserves of gold. They're increasing their gold reserves. So my question is, what would be the alternative to the economy based on debt? Would we go back with the gold reserves and ditch the monetary fractional reserve banking system? And what do you think about the economy based on resources? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Julius is up next, but he has a question from Bob Lyons in Costa Rica, who's online.
Yeah, so this is a question for Jeff. Do you personally believe that China and Russia are imperialist? Or do you think that they are a hybrid nation, as Lenin and Trotsky thought Russia was in 1917?
That question is from Bob Lyons in Costa Rica. Did you get the question, Jeff?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Corey, and then Bob McDermott.
Sure. I just had a couple quick points. I wanted to talk about what happened in Afghanistan. There are a lot of countries that I guess the U.S. is involved in where they restrict the production of competitive markets that would compete with their own markets. And so in Afghanistan, they actually encourage people to grow heroin because they don't grow heroin in the U.S., right? They don't grow poppies to process heroin. So they force them into sort of criminal activity to create an economy, and they safeguard against it. And I was wondering what you think about that as a sort of the monopolistic capitalist system takes over many parts of the world. And I sort of have the same sentiment on China as well, and I was going to ask you what you think about it if the capitalist class, dictates what the Communist Party does, or if the Communist Party dictates what the capitalists do around the world with the interests of China. And I think it's important to analyze this because obviously China is not a capitalist country traditionally, although it may be becoming one, but still the Communist Party has an iron grip, it seems, on the social political situation there. Let's just see, sorry. Just to do with what Trump was saying, what he says blatantly and openly, and I mean, I think he's sort of crazy. I don't know if he's exactly dumb, but he's normalizing sort of the language that he uses, and this is maybe empowering other people of the sort of the far right or fascist sort of mentality to be able to bring these things into the mainstream. And so I think he may be trying to push the white supremacist, vote, or whatever you want to say, the white supremacist popularity up, and make it more open or accepted within society. And to go back to that, and the last point I just want to close on is Hong Kong. And if you consider it all, consider it all similar to Nicaragua. The the protests that are happening there, because there were leftist groups involved in the protests. And I mean, as I've talked to maybe a comrade Yukon can say something else about this, but the leftists have been targeted by the protesters in Hong Kong. Though I think that in Nicaragua there was much more wealthy people involved in the protests. But some of the people who are behind the scenes in Hong Kong, I think, might also be of the capitalist class. Though it seems the base of the protest is impoverished, like poverty students that have no future, and they just don't have direction or leadership to organize for workers and to organize the worker state. Thank you.
Okay, Bob McDermott.
What's left of the left hasn't analyzed seriously imperialism for decades, so it's really good to have that panel, and it was really good. Jeff, you didn't talk much about Russia, so I haven't seen your documents, but I was kind of surprised that with the analysis that Russia was imperialist. I mean, to me, it's got an economy, the GDP, the size of about Portugal. It's manufacturing and engineering and infrastructure have all declined since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's basically a petrostate. Capital export is mostly flight capital of, the rich buying houses in London. So I just don't see, the only reason it's really important is because it inherited nuclear weapons, I think. So I just wonder if you could talk about Russia and the analysis of why Russia is considered imperialist.
Okay, so we got room maybe for one or two more speakers. Okay, I have one. Okay, I have two. And then I'm closing the speakers list. Pardon me?
Do you have a statement from someone in DC?
Somebody in BC? This one? Yeah, I'll get to it.
Okay.
Who's cheering here? Okay, so I have the two speakers, and then I'm going to come back to the panel. Go ahead, sister.
Okay, so this is mainly for you, Jeff. I heard you when you're talking about the leaders in South America and other places. And I also, before I say that, I would say that I was glad to hear that SA took a position where they make it very clear that it's not the governments of that are democratic, half capitalist like in South America that are to be attacked by the real imperialists. So having said that, I also have said that what happened in South America, and particularly in my country, that is Brazil, really taught me who are the people of my country, or at least half of them, and what they are up to, and they are up to no good, at least half of them. Just like in the States, you have all these wonderful people, and then you have all those assholes. So how bad it is that the South American leaders don't want to suffer or make their people suffer, and thus not having a real revolution. So has a revolution to be always violent, a civil war, bring thousands of deaths with it, and who dies in a civil war, what kind of injustice and opportunism happen in a civil war, like all kinds of injustices happened in Russia, in China, happened in Cuba too, years of homophobia after the revolution, all that stuff. Who really stays in power after such wars? Like, look at Stalin, look at Mao. And this, I'm just throwing this, you might comment on it or not. So I'd like to say that in the case of Brazil, Venezuela, Chile, Bolivia, maybe the reason why our leaders are not going full-blown is not because they are afraid or they don't want to hurt our people that maybe are so fragile. It is because they don't want us to become another Iraq, another Afghanistan, another Syria. My father used to tell me years ago when Brazil was doing good, he said, we own a debt, we own a debt to Iraq and Afghanistan because it's because what's happening with them that the Americans are not here on us. And then the Americans came on to us. And should we have behaved like Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and now be raised? I don't know, maybe, you tell me. So I have another question to you. It is like, what is your experience in winning an election or a revolution or conducting and governing a country after such?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. You're running to ruffle the feathers because you know that in a society such as the States, you cannot win. I'd like to make an exercise of imagination and think about what would you do if you won and what would happen to you and SA and the American people. And I went here and I'm saying it with love. I have been very aggressive with you in the past, but I'm saying it with love. I want to hear what you have to tell me.
Okay, Sam.
Thanks, Conrad. It's, a very heavy, I don't want to say philosophical question. It has a lot of material basis, the issues we're discussing, right? Because if we move to a theory of sub-imperialisms, a series of victims subjecting other victims, weaker states, direct, indirect imperialist domination. We're going through this process of victimization where nations of the world have this, I don't know if everyone heard something like a Colombian necktie on them in this capitalist system where your head will eventually explode, but you have a certain time as the blade comes toward your neck. But I think this discussion has huge relevance for activists in North America, because if we get into this kind of notion of the whole world is oppressor and imperialist, it can kind of numb you to the point where you lose all your groundings. And I think the most pertinent tasks as revolutionaries inside the belly of the beast in Canada, the sub-beast, is opposing our own imperialisms unequivocally and allowing for the self-determination of nations to manifest themselves. And that comes out in a different in our analysis in various ways. And these issues are very thorny, right? And revolutionary violence is a revolutionary war is it can be all encompassing and real, and a lot of us in this room have never necessarily participated in armed struggle, but we try to get ourselves up to the point where we're able to analyze these situations and offer solidarity in the best way we can. I mean, Shea famously said, for the sake of the revolution or the sake of the world, Bolivia must be sacrificed, right? He fully intended to start that revolutionary conflagration in Bolivia and create a general conflagration that would put the two camps and settle this, put the two camps beside each other and settle this question. I think back in terms of the Nicaraguan revolution and the dynamics there. I thought about a weird, something I read in The Jaguar Smile by Salman Rushdie. I don't recommend it, but it's interesting in just the situations he describes and being in Nicaragua during that time. He talks about the foreign minister, Escato, and I believe his name is Escato. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff. And he's having a conversation, Escato is detailing kind of a conversation he had with an American diplomat. And he asks him, well, what about the criminal court decision we just won, right? And the American diplomat says, well, Escato, that's just philosophy. Let's talk business, right? And it kind of emphasizes the world mafia setting that goes into these types of relationships, right? Is China the model of a future society, or is it a bureaucracy that's able to has be able to self-sustain itself like the Soviet Union? Were they more willing to throw their people in the meat grinder and churn it to get that profit out to sustain themselves when the Soviet Union wasn't able to or couldn't? It's another discussion. But yeah, just end on those points. Thank you.
Okay, Daniel, did I miss your hand? No. Okay. Okay, so before we come back to the panel, I have this solidarity message to read. And it's from Philippe Cornouaille. Some of you people here will know Philippe. He's living in Vancouver now, but he spent a lot of his life in living in Nicaragua. He says, greetings to all. The coup in Bolivia is not only a blow to indigenous people, it is a blow to the toilers of the region of all lands. In recent years, we have suffered from a chain of coup attempts, from Honduras to Venezuela, Paraguay, and Haiti, as well as the failed attempt in Nicaragua last year. To this, we must add the Brazilian soft coup against the Dilma Rousseff presidency and subsequent and esteemed working class leader. Washington's signature is on all of these anti-democratic coups. Ottawa has worked in tandem with the U.S. rulers to demolish and crush popular movements and governments in our hemisphere. Our task as partisans of liberation struggles targeted by the Canadian government is to organize broad popular opposition to Ottawa's complicity with U.S. imperialist wars and coup-making against countries it seeks to dominate and control in perpetuity. Socialist action as an exemplary record in this regard, seeking unity in the cause of self-determination and sovereignty for all nations. It stems from a commitment to working class and anti-imperialist internationalism. In the spirit of working class and anti-imperialist unity, I send my best wishes for the success of your conference. Ever onward to victory, Philippe Conroy. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the panel, and I'm going to start with Robbie and then Jeff, and you have 10 minutes each.
Well, as to whether there's...
She's a mic now.
First of all, around the question of financialization and whether there's any solution to tinkering with the financial system, I really don't think so. I think all roads lead to crisis for capitalism, and including in its financialized version. I don't think, all of the measures that have been tried qualitative, from the standpoint of capitalists, qualitative easing and low interest rates, are failing to regenerate another cycle of accumulation. And I think the capital system is headed for a crisis sooner or later. I don't predict catastrophe tomorrow, but this cannot last, and I think if we compound it with the climate crisis, there's going to be a reckoning and a profound breakdown of the system in its own terms. I went through in my distant teenage years, I witnessed the struggle for Medicare in Saskatchewan. in which the NDP and under its sainted leader T.C. Douglas did play a progressive role and did introduce the legislation that was to become the first Medicare program. But it's also true that this social democratic leadership proved to be quite incapable of defending this reform in the actual moment of crisis when there was a huge right-wing mobilization. And so, you have to ask yourself, why was that? Why was this leadership unable to defend its progressive initiatives and barely won that struggle? I mean, it only was able to win it because of the mobilization of the ranks of the working class and farmer base of the CCF to defend Medicare and to break the doctor strike. So I don't think it's sufficient, and I agree with Jeff on this, while we have to absolutely defend the pink tide governments against their own internal right-wing and extreme right-wing, in many cases, opposition from the local Latin American ruling classes, as well as from imperialist intervention and aggression. We can't place political confidence in them because they're not capable, in fact, of taking the struggle forward. That's what really matters. And so we have to take a bit of a step back and look at this in terms of the stakes that are involved. And I don't think it's sufficient to just rally around the existing leaderships of the popular movements as if that was the end of the line. We can't go any further. We're going to have to go further. And that's my comment on. I think the prospect of a catastrophic slaughter of people and revolutionary armed struggle. This is really quite fantastical. Really, I don't think that it's on the agenda. What would be on the agenda is some sort of mass struggle to defeat the right wing, and we may see that. We may see that with a different leadership. I don't think it will come from the PT leadership. I think it'll have to come from somewhere else. And I think it will. I have confidence in that. And I don't think we need to create scenarios of apocalyptic violence. What matters is the relationship of class forces and which class will prevail ultimately. We can't predict the nature of the struggle or invent fantasies of blood on the streets. What we do know is that if the right wing triumphs in the short term, there will be probably blood. There will be repression, and we hosted a forum in Montreal recently on Venezuela, which was disrupted by the Venezuelan pro-Guaido right wing in Montreal. These people are pretty vicious, and there wasn't violence at the meeting, but they disrupted it in a very determined fashion, and were full of class and I think racial hatred towards the whole Chavista experiment. No doubt we have to close ranks with those governments, absolutely. But it's not the only task we have to engage in. Russia. Well, I think Russia is a weak capitalist state. I would agree with that characterization. But to go from there to claim that Russia is conducting itself as an imperialist power, even in a regional sense, do we mean by that they suppress the Chechens? We don't support that, but that they grab Crimea. I mean, I don't really see these things as being a proof of Russian imperialism. And the danger here is particularly in what somebody said, the heart of the beast, or the sub-beast. The danger here is that we muddy the waters and we dilute our sense of who the real perpetrators of exploitation are in the world. We begin to kind of dilute our definitions, and the danger is that we will accommodate to the dominant imperialist discourse in the United States, Canada, and the other imperialist countries. I don't think that Jeff is saying that in any way, and I agree with him on the nature of our tasks. But it bothers me a little bit that in the United States, in our sister party in the United States, we would adopt and open ourselves up to this danger of saying, well, it's not just the United States, it's also Russia and China. I think this is an ongoing debate and discussion that we have to have, but it concerns me.
Well, I appreciate Robbie's remarks, and especially the point that we have no confidence in any of the capitalist leaders of these poor countries, whether it be Maduro, Chavez, Morales, and others. Our view is that we need a revolutionary party. But we don't think you can build that revolutionary party if you're blind to imperialist intervention. You have to be in the forefront of opposing that if you're going to have any credibility. Any Syrian formation that purports to lead the Syrian revolution against the Assad capitalist government that doesn't stand in the forefront against U.S. intervention, imperialist intervention, militarily, doesn't stand a chance to building a party there. That's the point I'm making. So we don't support any of these capitalist governments. We didn't support, we were the most critical of the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1917 and in 1979. I visited Nicaragua. I met with Ortega and Jaime Wheelock and Tomas Borge. And they invited me to their first International Solidarity Conference, the only one they ever had, because we were in the forefront of the United States of leading the anti-war movement that mobilized hundreds of thousands against US intervention in Central America and the Caribbean. They asked us to lead this. And we said in a comradely way, you can't make half a revolution. If you don't give the land to the peasants, the Contras are gonna eat you for lunch. If you don't nationalize the wealth of the country, you can't make a revolution like Cuba. And they gave us all kinds of explanations about how difficult it was. And that was the fundamental question that led to the split in the SWP, which abandoned Trotskyism on the grounds that they supported the interpretation of the workers' and farmers' government to be a long-term process which would be culminated in a socialist revolution some second stage down the road. That's why we formed Socialist Action after 500 of us were expelled from the SWP. Gary's right about trade deals. It's negotiations among the imperialists, but there are some odd nations there, and the main players set the rules. The difference is that Trump thinks he can advantage his own wing of the capitalist class by putting up tariffs in areas where they're weaker. But he doesn't understand that the game that the imperialists play is to try to mitigate the contradictions to continue a trade on a worldwide basis as opposed to stopping it. So, and that's why it's important to understand that China was admitted as a capitalist nation to the WTO, not as a worker state. They want to crush a worker state. They built China. They invested in China. They put billions of dollars because they got trillions back from China. So, and by the way, in regard to resolution of conflicts in the WTO, they have a board of arbitrators there, and it appears that the recent board, the US has lost its majority to control the results of the WTO. And therefore Trump said, if we don't control it like we wanted to, because of competition from the other imperialist countries, we want to impose our own tariffs to defend our industries. The ruling class thinks they have other alternatives, but it's simply a battle within the ruling class, nothing fundamental. China, there are thousands of strikes in China every year. Most of the strikes take place because workers aren't paid, because the capitalists aren't making any profits, because they're not competitive on world markets. So they simply don't pay the workers, thousands of times over. And there's imprisonment and deep repression. According to our Chinese comrades, you stand up and become a Trotskyist in China, you're in jail, or worse. I went to World Congress of the Fourth International, and I talked to our Pakistani comrades. We have a party there with 700 comrades, and we're in a party with thousands. And I asked these comrades what they thought about Chinese investment. Basically, they said the Chinese invested in major Pakistani ports, gave for billions of dollars. The Pakistanis defaulted, and the Chinese owned the ports. And this takes place in other areas where China exploits poor nations and ends up with their property, their wealth, and the workers in Pakistan are extremely resentful of Chinese capitalist, imperialist intervention. On the question that you asked, is there an alternative to an economy based on debt? The United States went off the gold standard under Nixon in the 1970s because a rebuilt Europe in the 1970s that was destroyed, our enemies and opponents were both destroyed in World War II, so we had not a century of capitalism, but we had 25 years from 45 to 70 or so of relative uninterrupted prosperity in the United States economy grew because we had no competition. The competition was destroyed at the war. They went off the gold standard because the rebuilt European countries and Japan and Germany didn't start with the technology the United States was still using. They started with state-of-the-art technology so they could produce cars like Toyota, Datsun, and so on much more efficiently. They were much more competitive. So the United States went off the gold standard, and today they have an unprecedented date in the history of the world. Their debt is like $18 trillion and growing. When they run out of money, they simply call down to the printers and say, print more money. And the money is in the form of bonds, which is paper, that has no value other than the fact that the dollar is the coin of the realm internationally, supposedly based on the productivity of the United States. But that's coming into increasing question. And in my opinion, that debt is going to come back big time. It started to come back again in 2008 with the crisis that practically brought down the economy. So I don't think there's anything resembling stability. And in fact, Nick gave me an article in the New York Times in the business section on yesterday that warned that we're repeating the same scenario. Low interest rates to prime the pump, to give it, to give money to the corporations to invest, who don't do it in productive facilities. Instead, they invest it in speculation, financialization. And that's a formula for catastrophe. As far as China, they have spent billions of dollars building massive cities that hold millions of people, and they're empty. They are empty. You walk down the streets of these cities, there's no people in housing complexes that were built for millions of people because they speculated, the capitalist profiteers, with private banks, off-the-record banks in China, in order to, because they thought the boom was coming and they could make a killing in real estate, like the Americans. There's a debate and discussion, is Trump a fascist in the United States, to answer another question. There are features that are extremely disturbing in the United States. They're going after the internet. They have a surveillance state that is unprecedented in the world. If they want to use it, they can. And they're arresting people. They arrested these 7 wonderful people who, whatever they did, Plowshare 7, they were protesting, they walked into a nuclear facility and they painted it. They sentenced them to 35 years in prison, pacifists, and they're appealing that. We just organized a tour of the Venezuelan embassy defenders, raised $8,000. These youngsters, some not so young, sat in the Venezuelan embassy because they said that it was illegal for the United States to give it to Guaido. They are charged with interfering with government protection of supposedly the Venezuelan government, but they protected Guaido's embassy, and they're threatened with a $100,000 fine each and a year in prison. And the United States wants to impose that. We see these encroachments on civil liberties, voting, and so on. And other horrors. The prison-industrial complex in the United States is increasingly privatized. There's 7 million people under the jurisdiction, the largest number in the world of the prisons, and half of them are in prison, and they're increasingly sent, the healthiest ones, to work in privatized prisons at an average wage of 50 cents an hour. For Fortune 500 companies, why would you need an immigrant working for minimum wage or a Mexican working for $10 an hour when you can have a black enslaved wages in the prison industrial complex? So this is another sign of a crisis-ridden capitalism. The hysteria over immigrants by both Democrats and Republicans is another example of divide and rule, to demonize the most oppressed, and women, and LGBT people, and violence. So there are disturbing signs, including Trump's mobilization of rallies of 10,000 people or more. Trump's election, in my opinion, was a relative fluke because he was running against Hillary Clinton, who was the, what do you call it, the epitome of the Wall Street capitalist sick system that everybody rejected. So they voted for a relative unknown like Trump. I don't think he'll be elected again. I don't think the American population is moving in that direction. A majority of young people in the United States, someone asked me about the young people, a majority of young people under 30 prefer socialism over capitalism.
1 minute.
According to the polls. Those are the people. When we went to a demonstration that our comrades played a leading role in organizing in Lake Superior against a pipeline with 1,500 people, 50 people signed our mailing list and 25 wanted to join our party. Legitimately join, not okay, I think about it. They wanted to join our party. That was an extremely interesting phenomenon. As far as Russia, Bob, it is the largest petrol state. Its basic income is by exportation of its natural resources, including gold, but oil, gas, and minerals, and stuff like that. And it's a regional power in that it has a predominant and exploitative influence in the former Soviet Union countries that broke away. I don't think you could say more than that, but its economic relations fit Lenin's model in a modest way. In a modest way. As far as Brazil and your arguments, those are very important arguments, but I respectfully disagree with you. The solution that Lula chose brought on Bolsonaro. Lula, when he was first elected, after missing 4 times in a row of the presidency, he went to Washington and made a deal. Elect me and I won't interfere with capitalist property. And his first act was an imposition of a massive austerity program against the Brazilian people that attacked pensions and everything else. The Workers' Party went from a workers' party to a bourgeois party. It ran as its vice presidential candidate. Under Lula, an open right-wing reactionary capitalist candidate. That was no longer a workers' party government. And Lula did exactly what the others did. And that is, he didn't nationalize the land. Brazil's the wealthiest country in Latin America. He didn't take control of the imperialist banks. He made reforms at a time when modest reforms were possible. But he proved incapable of solving those needs. And that's why the right-wingers come to power. Because the so-called reformists allow the imperialist corporations to control the wealth of the country, to control the oil, the gas, and the other natural resources. So when Venezuela's, when the price of oil declined. Now we also have a difference, which the more you get to know socialist action, the more you learn about the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution led to civil war because when it granted the greatest reforms in the history of the world, 1/6 of the land surface of the earth, it gave the peasants the land as their own. It set up a system of workers' rule through Soviets, not the party. The party didn't rule Russia. It was the working class and its own institutions through councils of workers, peasants, and soldiers. It liberated women like no other country in the world. It gave free health care. It gave the right of self-determination of all the oppressed nationalities. No one in history, no country has ever rejected its imperialist conquests under the Tsar. And it gave them full rights, including the right to secede. It canceled all its debts. It obliterated all the imperialist conquests of Tsarist Russia all over the world.
Wrap up, comrades, because we have to get out of here.
In reaction, the entire world intervened. Both sides of the imperialist war united to bring down that revolution. And they didn't have an army. Trotsky was the head of a 5,000-person Red Army. It became an army of 10 million. They recruited the peasants and the workers because they got the land and the oppressed nationalities, and they defeated the entire world, and it was one of the weakest imperialist countries under the Tsar because of the revolution. But they paid a price, and that's the origin of our party. They paid a price in the demoralization of 10 years of war and suffering brought on by imperialism. The working class began a retreat, and Stalin came to power, who murdered the whole leadership of the revolution, and Trotsky too. So we don't attribute the revolution to civil war. And it's the same thing in Latin America. The way to stop the slaughter in Brazil is to grant the vast majority the right to rule in their own name. Socialism. The same thing with Evo Morales and the others. You can't make a half a revolution. You cannot solve the needs of the people and the world imperialist system at the same time. For us, that's ABC. We don't say that Lula saved the country from civil war. Lula had the vast support of the population, could have done anything he wanted. But his promise to imperialism was that I won't do what I want, I'll do what's necessary to prevent imperialist encirclement, sanctions, and all the other horrors, which the imperialists did in any case. And they did it to Nicaragua, and they did it to Venezuela. There is no compromise with imperialism. It's a beast that must be obliterated from the face of the earth because of its inherent contradictions. It has nothing to do with the, and it's with Trump, we got the oil. This person said what every other government in the United States does, they fight wars for oil. Anyway, I wish I had more time, but it's been a glorious discussion. I appreciate every comment.